This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Linn Hammergren is an expert in the rule of law, citizen security, anti-corruption policies, and general governance issues. She has a doctorate in political science and, before 2008, taught political science at Vanderbilt University. She then spent 10 years with the World Bank and 12 as an internal consultant for USAID, managing administration of justice projects. Linn's research and publications focus on judicial politics and reform, judicial corruption, citizen security, and the politics of foreign assistance. Her most recent book is Judicial Reform and Development, Rethinking Assistance to Developing and Transition Countries. I spoke with Linn in Washington, D.C. Hi there, Linn. Thanks so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm happy to do this.
Linn, you have been in the development and aid world for a very long time. Right now, you've been an independent consultant for the last 6 years or so. What is it that your practice focuses on?
The topics that I focus on are rule of law, although that's getting a bit less popular with people who pay for this, citizen security, and anti-corruption.
Why do you say that rule of law is getting a little less popular? I'm always fascinated to hear about how topics change within our industry, right? So the different buzzwords or the different words you use to describe what you do changes. What was it before rule of law, and what do you think it's changing into now?
Well, I think basically citizen security is becoming more important because people are focusing on violence, and rule of law, as it started out at least, was focusing largely on human rights. And there are a lot of human rights groups around. But now the problem is, sort of a shift to the other side and saying, well, that was fine that you're going to protect the defendant, but who's protecting the citizens? I was pleased to see that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has now declared that citizen security is a human right. It really hadn't been before. I think rule of law is still there, and I certainly work on it, but also partly because of people like me who have written a lot about why rule of law wasn't working. I guess we went overboard, and now the donors have decided, well, that was then, we'll do something else. It may come back, it may not. I've done some work in Eastern Europe where it's still important because of the EU accession criteria. But in Latin America, where I've worked largely, donors just aren't funding those projects anymore.
Take us a little deeper into what citizen security entails. You mentioned violence. We've actually had a couple other guests on the show previously who that's their focus as well from the donor perspective. So when you're talking about that type of work, what does it focus on?
Well, there are two sides to it, and the two sides often fight with each other. One of them looks like part of rule of law. It's a criminal justice system, but rather than focusing on courts, it largely focuses on police and prosecutors. But the other part is the violence prevention largely in communities, and has to do with things like community mobilization, working with youth at risk, various kinds of work with gangs. Sort of goes on from there. And one of the projects I'm looking at now is actually focusing on trying to reduce the panic. It sounds like the Ebola crisis. This is bad, but it's not as bad as the newspapers say kind of thing. And trying to focus on successes of communities or countries, although it largely tends to focus on communities, on their successes in preventing gangs from coming in, cooperating with police in criminal cases, and so on.
Do you have a specific story or a moment that you can think of over the last couple of years where you were working on a project and you said, wow, this is definitely an initiative that worked in this community to prevent violence or gangs coming in, that kind of thing?
Well, it's more on the other side that we're trying too many things and we need to understand better. I can't really think of one, although a lot of my work is evaluation, assessments, and project planning. I guess more focusing on, the successes there have been few, but it's new things, so maybe something is going to come up.
Like, give me an example.
Well, I suppose one of them is the use of community centers to organize communities to try and look at their problems and resolve them. I just looked at an interesting thing that the State Department is actually, the U.S. State Department is actually focusing on. It's a very small project, providing, it's working with an NGO to provide lawyers and social workers and psychologists to work with victims, to encourage them to cooperate in investigations of the crime that's committed against them. I think that's an interesting line of work, and it's one that sort of combines rule of law, as I've worked on it for a long time, with the violence prevention. One of the things that people talk about, but they haven't really been able to do, because in developing countries it's hard, is alternative sentencing for small criminals and finding jobs for people who have been in prison.
And by alternative sentencing, you mean something other than just jail time?
Something other than sending them to jail.
Mm-hmm. Are there any particular programs that you thought, wow, that was a really cool initiative that they got off the ground?
I think mainly the problem in developing countries is just that there's underemployment. And so the citizen who considers him or herself not to be a criminal often gets a bit testy about finding jobs for criminals. And it's hard to find alternative programs. You know, we do a lot of community service in the U.S. and in other developed countries, but those are actually harder to set up and monitor than people often imagine. So it's going to be a long haul.
Yeah. Tell me, what's the biggest challenge of setting up and monitoring them? Why is that so different than anything else?
Well, I can just think of a story which has to do with something else. I was working in a country where they wanted to use the sort of monitoring devices, the bracelets or the wristlets
sure. Mm-hmm.
that are put on people who are awaiting a trial, or whose sentence is just to stay away from someone. And it turns out that in the United States, and this is in the U.S., this is often given to private companies to monitor, and they underpay the people who do it, and the people aren't watching. So unless you can put the bracelet on someone, but if no one's monitoring where that person is, you don't even have to worry about them taking it off. They just go about whatever they want to do. Uh-huh. So that's a problem, and it's costly, to do this. And I think people just think put the bracelet on, and then the person will do what they ought, go where they ought to go. But what's often not paid attention to are the accompanying costs of making the program work. This happens in a lot of sectors. I mean, there's the Damberger TED Talk about the water pumps. We put the pumps in, but we forgot that someone has to maintain them.
Sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's the same sort of thing, that something that seems like a nifty idea often has a lot of additional costs that people don't think about. We're finding out about this, and I think people will come up with some ways of doing this. But thinking that it worked, often people believe that it worked in a developed country, and when you look at it, you find out that the success rate was much lower than is being sold. And it's going to be much harder in a developing country where you don't have the funds to do all these additional things, and plus you may not have the trained people to do them.
You brought up an interesting thought there, or an interesting theme, that we see similar failures or similar challenges across a broad spectrum of development initiatives, depending on what your focus is.
Yeah.
We're talking about the pumps. You see it in citizen security. Which brings to mind the question, so when you're implementing or working on a citizen security program, is that often in conjunction with other work? Do you find most often that you are looking at programs that are operating in isolation? And what kinds of things are they connected to? Is it...
Let's take the community approach, which is a favorite one. It's very odd, but in many of these, citizen security suddenly sprang up. There were groups who were doing rule of law, but they didn't see it coming. And so it's other groups, often municipal planners in the World Bank, the Social Development Group, who ended up grabbing onto these programs. The rule of law people were just a little slow. But I think that then the problem becomes that the people who have adopted this haven't learned from the mistakes of others, and so they're often not thinking about these additional things that you have to do. And the community focus in Latin America becomes very difficult because many communities and even municipalities don't control the pieces of the puzzle that you really need in order to have a successful crime prevention program at the community level. For example, in Mexico, the current president is trying to sort of nationalize the police force, but many municipalities, as a result, have lost their police forces. So you're doing this without the police. And although maybe you're not trying to build up the police, if you're going to do crime prevention, you do need police at some point so that people who decide, yes, we want to do something, have somewhere to go. Also, communities, municipalities don't control education. They don't. All of these services tend to be centralized. with the grand exception of Peru, I will note, which decentralized everything. But the kind of pieces that you have to put into a program are often not controlled by the geographic entity, the government entity that's supposed to be applying it. And that means that they're often left with a very small cafeteria list of things they can do, which often come down to meetings, exhortations to citizens to behave and to report crimes, and posters. So these pieces, if you're working at the community level, you're still going to have to work with organizations that are controlled at a higher level, nationally or at the state level, and not necessarily by a municipality.
And do you find that this is, I mean, you're clearly an expert at this. Is this recognized by donors? Is this recognized by funding agencies? And if so, what's their response to that?
I would say not. I think that, one of the problems is people who are working on crime prevention often don't know a whole lot about how a government is organized. So they talk about these programs without realizing that, in many countries, these programs are not controlled at the level at which we want to work. By programs, I mean things like these additional things like education, like even courts and police. They tend to be more centralized in control. And so when a mayor decides that he or she wants to do something, the strings that he or she can pull are very few in number. And I think donors just don't. I've heard donors say, we need to do these kinds of programs. And you want to say to them, yeah, but those programs can't be implemented at the level at which you want to work.
At the risk of, taking us down that rabbit hole, why is that? I mean, you'd think that the person on the, the desk officer or the person who's got their finger on the money would be an expert like yourself. Why isn't that a case?
But they had to have their doctorate in political science to understand how governments are organized. I think that's part of it. I mean, I've often found, I remember once when I was in Ecuador, I think, talking to some IT experts who wanted to put in some kind of system, and I had to explain to them that judiciary is an independent branch of government. And then we got into the 3 branches of government routine, although I think Ecuador now, with its new constitution, has several more branches. But in any case, that isn't something they'd studied. And I think this people who have a background in, say, social development probably haven't looked at, it's been a long time since they took Poli-Sci 101, the one about branches of government and how they're interrelated. So I think it's just a question of moving into an area without the additional background that you need in order to understand what you're going to, the technical part, what your organization does, or what your sector does, but you don't understand the wider governmental framework.
I think this gives us a great moment to sort of pivot a little bit and talk about how you got to where you are today. You've had a great career arc. I'm looking at your LinkedIn profile as we talk about this, and I don't know if you started in 1984, but that's, the first war country that you had there. So 2 questions then. So first is, did you know you were always going to get into development work? You've got your PhD. Were you always focused on getting into this field, or did this come upon you somehow?
No, I think I was not always focused on it, although my graduate studies were in Latin American politics, and my dissertation looked at sort of decentralization and linkages between different levels of government. But I thought I was going to teach political science. To just tell the truth, I didn't get tenure. Mm-hmm. And so I was looking for something else. I didn't get tenure because I pig-headedly decided I wanted to finish my book, which came, rather than write 3 articles, or even if I had written 1 article, I probably would have managed. But I finished the book, but it was too late. It was published after I'd left the university, almost immediately after. So I just looked for something else, and over the short run, found some work with USAID teaching. And it kind of went on from there. I was teaching political analysis to AID staff. Mm-hmm. One of the staff, and then one of the staff members was working in Peru, noticed that I'd written my dissertation on Peru and seemed to know something about the Peruvian public administration. So he offered me a contract to go there and do some work on, actually I was negotiating counterpart budgets with the Peruvian government. And then at some point, someone had a project on judicial reform, and there was no one to do it, and so I raised my hand, and it kind of went on from there. But I think a lot of people's careers are like that. I talk to people who have their career planned out 20 years in advance, and maybe you have to do that. But mine has been a series of fortuitous accidents.
That's very much the standard.
Is it?
It's much more. Yeah, it's much more common for us to hear on this show in particular.
Yeah.
That people have this career has found them, is how I put it, rather than the other way around.
And sometimes something that looked like really bad turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because I ended up taking a slightly different route there, and it turned out to be much more satisfying than what I had planned to do. I would have been bored to death if I continued teaching political science. But at the time, it seemed terrible that I wasn't going to get tenure and had to find something else.
Sure.
And yet, when I think what my life would have been like, I've been able to do more research and have more research funds as working for development agencies than I ever would have had at the university.
So you spent the first, let's call it 10 years or so, working with USAID and USAID contracts.
Yeah.
And then you shifted to the World Bank. What happened there?
I'd been living overseas for 12 years, and I decided I needed to come back because everyone had kind of forgotten. They'd say, yes, Linn Hammergren. Well, I wonder whatever happened to her. And AID was moving me around as they wanted to do, but I just wasn't happy with the thing flowing that way. So I applied for I actually was kind of invited, but I also applied for a fellowship to work with AID in Washington, writing up my experience. And as a result of that, I not only wrote some monographs for AID, but also finished another book. And that caught someone's attention in the World Bank. And they offered me a job. I had to compete for it, but there wasn't a whole lot of competition. And I got a job with the World Bank. So I sort of went from here to there. AID was never going to give me a full-time job. Or a real job. They were quite happy having me as a consultant or as a fellow. But that didn't seem like it was going anywhere. So I took a job with the World Bank.
And you continued to focus on the same thing, on...
Yeah, but they actually, by then, people recognized that I managed very well in the area of rule of law. They were really very flattering as to how much I knew. And so that was what I was hired to do in the World Bank. And then fortuitously, no one at the World Bank would let me do a project. There's a lot of competition for that. So I got all the research work in the area. And that was fabulous. It taught me a lot. I learned some new techniques. And it also raised my profile. So, but that's another example of something that was unplanned. And in the beginning, although I didn't really realize it was bad. If you wanted a career in the World Bank, you had to do a lot of projects. I didn't even know that.
I'm just thinking, I probably
really happy to do the research.
Well, I was just thinking I could probably name 50 people in my contact network that would salivate for that kind of opportunity to sort of be a researcher.
I'm not sure you can do it anymore. I mean, at that point, there was a lot of research money in the bank and for working on rule of law. And so it all came my way. And then I found when the money ran out, I found creative ways to get other people to fund the projects. So I was able to do about 6 studies on what happened to court cases in that many Latin American countries. And that was very novel, and it got a lot of attention, but it also taught me a whole lot.
And then in 2008, you decided to make the leap to becoming a...
I didn't decide. The World Bank has a draconian retirement policy.
Aha. Okay, that's the question. So why did you become
62, you're out. And I turned 62, and the month I turned 62, I was out. That was it. And in the beginning, it wasn't, I actually had more work, much of it from the World Bank. They've now changed the policy, so you can't do that. But I had more work than I had before, and I also had work in other regions. I wasn't working in Latin America so much. I did a lot of work in Africa, some in Malaysia, and I was also freed up to work with other agencies. So I did work for the IDB, I did work for the Open Society Justice Initiative, I did work for the Australian Court. None of that would I have been able to do if I'd stayed working in the World Bank. It gave me a lot more exposure, and then the World Bank, when they hired, well, they financed the work in Africa, But more recently, I've been doing work in Eastern Europe.
And so if you had had your druthers, would you have stayed with the bank, or have you found now that, again, it's been a happy circumstance that you've been independent? Obviously, the work has been a more diverse.
Yeah, and it's certainly not as it's always nice to get a paycheck regularly, but I think I've been happier doing what I've been doing. So I was angry when I had to leave, but as it turned out, it probably was for the better. I've been able to take the things that I learned doing so much work in Latin America and use them elsewhere, and also learn about situations in other countries which were different from those in Latin America. It also got me into citizen security, which in the bank, in the department where I was working, I probably couldn't have done. Mm. But I got hired by other agencies to do that on the basis of the rule of law work, and so I branched out into citizen security. And that also let me go back to, while I was working in AID, we mainly did criminal justice. The World Bank, during the time I was there, would not touch criminal justice. In fact, when I wanted to do research on criminal justice, someone said, "You can't do that." And I said, well, it's kind of hard to talk about a court caseload if you can't look at the criminal cases. I'm not going to encourage you to work on them, but it's going to look like a very empty caseload if we exclude them. So being a consultant allowed me to go back and do that and pull the things that I learned while working for 12 years with AID and criminal justice to apply that to work in citizen security. It meant I had to go beyond that because the work with AID had largely been with government agencies, and citizen security, as I said, also involves the part with community mobilization, prevention, as opposed to just crime control. But it was not that hard a leap to make.
What are the pieces of being on your own most frustrating for you?
Well, I suppose part of it is just hunting for work. I mean, sometimes it comes and sometimes it doesn't. There are periods when I just sit for 3 months with nothing to do, and then periods when everyone wants me and I've got so much work, it looks like 24/7. And people in the World Bank and AID are under a lot of pressure. I will not deny that, but the work seems to come in clumps when you're a consultant. And sometimes you have to turn down interesting things. And then, of course, there's a thing where someone says they want you, and the contract keeps being delayed, and in the meantime, you turn down work that might have been more interesting. I guess I'm too honest there. I don't want to tell anyone I'll work for them and then take a job with someone else.
Sure, of course.
So I think that's the frustrating part. Otherwise, I think the work is probably not that different. I mean, the problems and the advantages are probably not that different from what it would be working full-time for an agency.
How do you divide up your time? Is your preference to sort of have one contract, one client, and you finish that work and then go on to the next, or do you usually have several projects?
That's my preference, but it never works out that way.
Sure. And
so a couple of years ago, I was doing work in Malaysia, and then the Australian court wanted me for something, and it was like I would have loved to stay in Malaysia a week or two and see parts of it I hadn't seen, but I had to come back immediately. And so that's very frustrating when the jobs pile on.
Yeah. Is there a fundamental difference between bank work and aid work, USAID work specifically, that you felt? I mean, is there a real culture difference? Is there a real focus difference?
Well, let's see if I can be diplomatic about this. Well, I think I had some second thoughts. I mean, I had some reservations about going to the World Bank because I think particularly in governance work, big loans are not the way to go. In AID, I was much more hands-on. I actually was in the countries where I had projects, I lived, and I usually had one project. When I worked in the bank, I was stationed in Washington, and I might have 5 or 6 things going on at once. That's very frustrating. First, because you can't be there. And second, because your attention is really divided. Also, some of the things that happen with those big loans I'm not very happy about, and they include a lot of building of courthouses and, just buildings. I'm known as Miss Anti-Infrastructure in the World Bank because it's called buildings, but it's not capacity building. This is bricks and mortar building. I found it interesting when one of the people from the education sector said when we were in a meeting, in education, we used to think that promoting education was about building schoolhouses until we built a lot of them and saw that nothing was happening. And then we realized it was about something else. So that, there's a lot of pressure in the multilateral banks on just the size of the loan, and the only way to make a loan sizable really is to build. So that I don't like. But they both become very bureaucratic. When I was in AID, I got to spend a lot of time out with my projects. And I now hear AID staff complaining that they're having to spend most of their time in their office. And the same thing happens to the World Bank.
Sure.
Very bureaucratic.
When was a time you can remember when you completely failed, or a project you were working on completely failed? And what was your strategy for either kind of sort of picking yourself, dusting yourself off, or taking the next step?
Well, I suppose I started having problems in Costa Rica. I was working with a minister who, it was very odd. She didn't like me, and it turned out later she didn't like me because I worked with the person she decided me to work with.
Complexities of Latin American culture.
Yeah, I thought I ought to write a novel about that one. So then when I went on to El Salvador, she basically told people there that I was difficult to work with. And in the end, we just decided the project wasn't working. Well, it had done what it could do, but the counterparts didn't want to work with me, and I clearly wasn't working well with them. So I made arrangements to leave and went to Washington and took the fellowship. And it was a feeling of failure because basically I just wasn't going to be able to work there anymore. But on the other hand, I wasn't all that sorry to leave El Salvador. And once again, something that seemed like a bad idea forced me to change directions, and it ended up being a good change.
That's really interesting to feel like you could be blacklisted across all of Latin America in that way. In this, I guess it's
countries. It was only 2 countries, but the minister was friends with the minister in El Salvador.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And let me tell you that the judicial world is very small.
Well, I was just going to say, and when you have the judicial world inside the small universe of either Costa Rica or El Salvador, it's got to be 6 people.
Yeah. I mean, I was great friends with the former president of the Supreme Court in Costa Rica, but he couldn't help. I mean, this was just the way things were falling. He wasn't particularly friends with the minister in El Salvador. Mm-hmm. But, those things happen. As it turned out, the person who replaced me also had problems, so it was not a good situation.
So on the other side of that coin, we all have a Rolodex of stories that we like to tell. I imagine you've got hundreds of them. It's the one that you tell while you're at the bar with somebody having a glass of wine, or somebody you meet for coffee sometime. What's your favorite story that you like to tell people the first time you meet them, or when you're sitting around with friends?
Oh God. Well, I just told one of them, which was the problems with the minister in Costa Rica. We'll try and find a more positive one.
I always like to think of, it's I was driving down the road in El Salvador one day, and then we got a flat tire, and then this happened. That kind of story.
Yeah. My mind has gone absolutely blank, and I'm usually full of war stories. Well, I suppose one of the delightful ones was walking into a court in Ethiopia. This is a positive one. I'm going to see the vice president of the court. Everyone has said this is a key person to work with. And I walk in, and I give my card to the guy, and he says, "Oh, you're Linn Hammergren." And I'm like, an Ethiopian knows who I am? But it turned out this was a very studious judge. He was writing his dissertation, and he read my books, and it turned out we had a really good working relationship. He helped with a study I did there, which was partly to showcase the things that he'd done with an automated case tracking system, which no one expects to find in Ethiopia, but they had one. And in fact, when I go to Latin America, I often say, if the Ethiopians can do it, why can't you? And the vice president of the court, he's since got moved somewhere else, and I think is retired. But he would get up in the morning, and he'd open his computer, and he would look at what was happening in the federal courts. Who was, what cases were there. It wasn't to decide the content of the cases. It was just to see whether the judges were keeping up with their work. And interestingly, when I went a year or 2 later to Malaysia to look at a project that the court had done there, they asked the World Bank to document the project. Unfortunately, it was a good one because I didn't know what I would do if it wasn't. The president of the court there had the same practice. He'd track judges on his BlackBerry to see who was getting behind. So, there was first the pleasure of walking into a court and having someone recognize who you are. But there was also the interesting comparison of two very progressive judges in courts where one might think that you wouldn't find that. So anyway, that's my story. I'm still in touch with both of them, just periodically. I have tried very hard to get other donors to use them in some of their projects. I mean, one of the things I've found, the judicial leaders who take that kind of attitude are concerned about the services that are being provided, are not just abstract jurists, are few and far between. And I would really like to get donors to use them. And I have not been successful in doing that. I also met a former president of the Swedish Supreme Court who'd done some interesting reorganizations in Sweden, and who I ran into him because he did an evaluation of a World Bank project, and somehow the evaluation got lost, I think on purpose, because it was not very positive. But it's interesting because he was able to do this without even speaking Spanish. But judges who are very good can walk into a court and see what's not working, even if they don't understand the language.
That's really interesting. I thought it's got to be a great feeling, flying to a remote location in the world such as Ethiopia and having someone greet you and say, "Oh, I've read your books." That's a fantastic feeling.
And particularly, I don't expect it, but I would be less surprised if it happened in Latin America. But Ethiopia it was the first time I'd ever been there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. My last question for you, Linn, is one that I ask everybody here on the Terms of Reference podcast. You've been in this business a long time. You've seen a career arc through USAID, through World Bank, and you've watched umpteen probably professionals come and go. What's your advice right now, your critical one or two pieces of advice you give to someone who's either coming out of a master's degree or who's interested in transitioning to this kind of work, who finds themselves in that serendipitous moment about how to be successful?
Well, first, and I've done a lot of arguments on LinkedIn about this, I think a master's degree in international development is probably not a good place to start. I think you need to have something substantive. This was less true when I started. I taught myself as I went along. I often feel as though I gave myself another graduate degree just by doing a lot of hard study on the judiciary and judicial administration, something I never paid any attention to when I was studying for my doctorate. So, but I don't think that's a possibility now. I think if you want to do this, you've got to not just be starry-eyed and want to help the poor. You've got to have something that you can bring to the table. I see a lot of people on LinkedIn who they've always wanted to work for the World Bank, or they've always wanted to work for AID, or they've always wanted to work in international development. And I just keep thinking, well, it's like a lottery getting in, but you'd probably have more chance if you had something substantive. And the other thing is to get working experience, not necessarily as an intern Xeroxing, but to try and build up a dossier of things that you've done by working for, you may not like working for consulting firms, but they do have work. And they're more willing, perhaps, than donors to let someone come in and do some work on a short-term project. And if you can do enough of that, you make contacts, you prove that you can do something, you learn what you can do, and you also may come into contact with an agency, either an NGO or a donor, where you really want to work. The other thing, well, I think, and it's still true, you really can't. It's nice to have a plan, but I'm not sure a plan ever works. So you've got to have, plan A, B, C, D, and E, and be willing to go with that. The other thing that, I find people who want to get into international development, and some of the advice that I've given and others have given, although I must admit I don't know whether this would work, but if you want to do something, say with NGOs or with education or whatever in the development field, get a job in your own country doing that first. It makes you more credible. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, but as I say, I don't know what, it strikes me logically that this is where it's happening. And a third thing is, I think that particularly in areas like mine, the funding may come more and more directly from countries and less from donors. And so you may have to be prepared to work directly for national governments, which is hard. I've done it, and sometimes getting paid. I've always been paid, but it's taken a long time in some cases. But I think that I was doing some work in Mexico and asked to do it by the Mexican Supreme Court. I put together a team and we did an analysis. And someone from the World Bank said, well, why don't you work through us? And I said, but why? I probably have gotten paid more, but it also would have cost the Mexicans much more because there would have been a huge overhead of my salary. And I didn't see much point. We skipped a lot of the bureaucracy. I actually did get paid on time there. And the services got delivered. So I think that that's going to become an alternative modality for people, but it then becomes extremely important to be able to do something. To have a knowledge and expertise that people want and that they're willing to pay you to give them.
Linn, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.